Hey, it's Tuesday, December 9th, and we have just seen the absolutely strictest ban on social media use by kids ever established go into effect in Australia. So Australia now makes it such that no kid under the age of 16 is allowed to get onto a major social media platform. That's a platform that allows them to post content, be algorithmically directed to content, and be paired together socially. That is, of course, a big and very sort of vague category, and a lot of sort of private messaging apps and gaming platforms are hoping to be exempted from this. But your big wigs, your TikTok, your Instagram, your Snapchat, those companies are now responsible for making sure that kids under the age of 16 do not have accounts on their platform, on their service. And they are liable for any infractions of that. This is not going to be something where they bring charges against kids or against families. They're going to bring fines against the companies. That is the way they're going to do this. I'm in New York City. I was just on the BBC talking about this, and one of the questions that they were, of course, interested in is what the world's reaction is going to be to this. And of course, when you look at the United States, the place where, we invented this stuff and export the majority of it, there are almost no rules here in the US about this stuff. And even though we just had lawmakers on Capitol Hill this week looking at child exploitation and child bullying and other forms of very dark behavior, dark things happening on the internet, there's really no bipartisan will to certainly put anything like a blanket ban into effect. The only rule we have here in the United States that covers kids is something called COPPA, C-O-P-P-A, Child Online Privacy Protection Act. It went into effect in 1998, right? That's how old this act is. And it basically just draws in parental consent, make sure you've got your parents' permission before you get online, and it's supposed to enforce a certain form of transparency from these platforms as to what data they collect on kids. It doesn't say you can't collect the data, it says you have to tell people about it, and you have to get parental permission. Now, why 13? Well, it's ridiculous, right? Any psychologist could tell you that not only is 13 not the age of good choices being made on the internet, 16 isn't either. 18 isn't even the right age. They say that your brain is not fully developed, not really cooked until you're 25. A guy named Mitch Prinstein, who's the chief science officer of the American Psychological Association, has gone before Congress multiple times to say, listen, this thing is an all-gas, no-brakes machine for the teenage brain. The teenage brain is looking for social cues and social reinforcement, and social media just turns on the gas underneath that kid. So, literally, it isn't until 25 that your brain that the turkey is fully cooked and ready to be taken out of the oven. So, all of that, said, we don't have any rules in the United States at the federal level as to data privacy, data transparency. The only rules, and they're not very strong rules, apply to kids under the age of 13. So we here have almost nothing going on in the regulation department, even though we make this stuff, right? The rest of the world, however, is looking very closely at what Australia is doing and is in some cases poised already to mimic it. Malaysia on January 1st is going to put in their own under 16 ban. And in the EU, we've seen all kinds of proposed solutions like maybe not an outright ban, but a nighttime curfew, that kind of system, which, I don't know about you, but that's something I impose on my kids already, right? I wouldn't mind if every kid had to abide by that. I mean, the tough part of going first is the anger you will get from the kids about this, right? This is an effort to try on a national level to turn back the clock. Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, is saying, that they're trying to get back to a real childhood, and that you Australian kids are going to know what a real childhood is like in a way that the rest of the world does not. And that may be true. Certainly they're going to know something that the rest of the world does not. It is really hard to imagine something like this working if a lot of other countries don't jump into it, right? Because of the way in which an Australian kid is going to end up feeling sort of left behind in this way. That, I'm sure, will be a really powerful thing that certainly the tech companies will seize on in this case. The thing I do want to point out, though, that I think is really interesting is that this new law in Australia makes Australia a stricter environment around this stuff than China. China has very strict laws about kids and social media. For one thing, they don't let Western social media companies into the country, right? You can't have Instagram or X in China. They don't allow that. And it's one of the great victories, geopolitical victories of that country to have had TikTok, which the company says, of course, is not a Chinese company, but it, of course, in many ways is. Having exported that to the West is one of the great coups of modern Chinese history. But, we in the United States don't have, none of our social media is allowed in China. And in China, even the homegrown stuff has to have very strict rules in place when it comes to kids. Not a blanket ban, but a requirement that, for instance, they have to have a youth mode in all of these social media platforms. So for instance, the equivalent of TikTok in China, kids under the age of, I think it's under the age of 13, which again, why is that the rule? It's not really clear. TikTok is entirely a STEM product. All you see on there is like science and engineering videos. So very strict rules there, but not as strict as Australia. And one big question that a lot of people have, of course, is enforcement. How are you going to figure out whether a kid is 12, 13, 14? You're not allowed under Australian national law to make them present an ID. You're not allowed to compel ID, showing a driver's license. That's for some reason prohibited there. I don't really know the history of that, but that is the law there. And the age verification systems that we've seen through AI don't always work. My uncle has been texting me recently to tell me that he's trying to get on TikTok and the age verification system is telling him he's not allowed, which is hilarious for a guy in his 80s. And so, we don't really know how enforcement is going to work. But I think the real question is going to be, what are the long-term effects going to be around this? Even though, already we've seen politicians in Australia signaling that if there's a change of government, they might seek to change this. Because I'm sure they're just getting holy hell from their constituents about this in many cases. If this thing does hold for a couple of years, that will present one of the most fascinating control groups for study that we've ever had in the modern technology era. When I speak to pediatricians and research psychologists about what it is to try and study the effects of social media on the brain, especially a developing brain, one of the great challenges is it's impossible to find a control group. Even Quaker kids, or not Quaker, what am I trying to say? Is it Quaker? Mennonite kids, even kids, Amish kids, even Amish kids have phones, right? And are in many cases allowed social media. And so it's almost impossible to find anybody who has not been exposed to this stuff throughout their formative years. So the fact that there's going to be 27.2 million Australians under this ban, and that many, so many kids, millions of kids, who will have been held off of social media entirely for a certain period of time, the ability to do a longitudinal study based on that is going to be really fascinating. And if the results that come out of that is, for instance, something like a lessening of the mental health crisis that we're seeing in all these Western democracies, including our own, a greater sense of purpose, a greater sense of satisfaction, any of these kinds of measures of well-being and mental health, you can imagine that people are going to respond at the national level, I would hope, at the national level in a very different way. It feels to me like this sort of laissez-faire, literal Wild West we have been in which tech companies have been left to regulate themselves. In Australia, this is the single greatest experiment in what social media has done to kids and what kids will be like without it that we have seen in the modern world.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.